Okay, so today we will have an overview of culture and heritage. First, we will talk about culture and the cultural domains. Then we will talk about heritage and the heritage resource classifications. And then we'll talk about what we call as cultural heritage. And finally, we'll talk about the related domains. So the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, defines culture as the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or a social group, and that it encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyle, ways of living together, value system, traditions, and beliefs. From here, we can understand three things. First, that culture is not limited to something physical. It also includes the spiritual, intellectual, and emotional aspect. Second, it is something shared by a group of people, so not only one. And lastly, it has a very wide scope. To be able to cover the spectrum of what comprises culture, UNESCO created the Framework for Cultural Statistics, or FCS, where culture is classified into six domains. Aside from that, it also covered two related domains, which will also be discussed in this lecture. So the cultural domains represent a common set of culturally productive industries, activities, and practices. The six domains are culture and natural heritage, performance and celebration, visual arts and crafts, books and press, audiovisual and interactive media, and design and creative services. So natural heritage is defined by UNESCO as consisting of natural features, geological and physiographical formations, and delineated areas that constitute the habitat of threatened species, of animals and plants, and natural sites of value from the point of view of science, conservation, or natural beauty. So it includes nature parks and reserves, zoos, aquaria, and botanical gardens. An example in the Philippines is the underground river of Puerto Princesa in Palawan. So these are natural features, natural formations, and then they are valued because of the scientific, well, scientific learnings that we can get from that. Maybe because of the uh, flora and fauna, or even the geological composition of the site. UNESCO defines cultural landscapes as representing combined um, works of nature and by humans. And they express a long and intimate relationship between people and the natural environment. So this is not only nature, but also um, there is the intervention of man. Okay, so the best example here in the Philippines is the rice terraces in Banawe. So man was trying to shape nature to be able to sustain themselves. At the same time, it works well because they follow the contours, no, of the mountains. And for a long time, this relationship between nature and man thrived. Okay, so that's why it's very important. What was not discussed here is actually works that are done by humans alone, and this refers to urban districts, or not only heritage districts, because it can be rural, like the Calle Crisologo of Vegan, which I was not able to put here as part of the slides. Performances and celebrations include all expressions of live cultural events, including performing arts and music. Performing arts include both professional and amateur activities, such as theater, dance, opera, and puppetry. It also includes the celebration of cultural events, festivals, feasts, and fairs that occur locally and can be informal in nature. So in Cebu, um, Sinulog Dance Festival is a very good example of this activity. Music is defined in this domain in its entirety, so regardless of format. As such, it includes live and recorded musical performances, music composition, music recordings, digital music, including music downloads and uploads, and musical instruments. So there are many examples. The one I showed here is the um, Miss Pilita Corrales, who was hailed as Asia's Queen of Songs during the 70s and the 80s. Okay, so she sort of represented the Philippines. Visual arts are art forms that focus on the creation of works which are visual in nature. They are intended to appeal to the visual sense and can take many forms. The visual arts and craft domain includes fine arts such as painting, drawing, sculpture. Then you have crafts and photography. Commercial places where the objects are exhibited, such as commercial art galleries, are also included in this domain. Okay, so they're part of the cultural domain. Um, in the example I'm showing here is a painting entitled Ang Magbabayo or Pounding Rice, rendered by Vicente Manansala in 1979. Books and press represents publishing in all its various formats: books, newspapers, and periodicals. It also includes the electronic or virtual forms of publishing, such as online newspapers, e-books, and the digital distribution of books and press materials. Libraries, both physical and virtual, are included in this domain, as are book fairs. So an example that falls under this domain is a book uh, written by Dr. Rosa Rizal, no, Noli Me Tangere. Audiovisual and interactive media are radio and television broadcasting, including internet live streaming, film and video, and interactive media. So interactive media covers video games and new forms of cultural expression that mainly occur through the web or with a computer. So it includes online games and web portals, websites for activities, which relates to social networks such as Facebook and internet podcasting such as YouTube. So all of these social media platforms are actually part of culture. Well, example of the uh, film or audiovisual, which is an old film starring Nora Honor, is Himala, no? A vintage movie. The design and creative services domain did not exist in the 1986 uh, FCS, Framework for Cultural Statistics. But this domain covers activities, goods, and services resulting from the creative, artistic, and aesthetic design of objects, buildings, and landscape. So the domain includes fashion, graphic and interior design, landscape design, so architectural and advertising services. So the furniture designs of Mr. Kenneth Kabonpe, for example, falls under this domain. Architecture and advertising are part of the core cultural domains, but only as services. The primary purpose of architectural and advertising services is to provide a creative service or an intermediary input into a final product that is not always cultural. So note that all buildings that are included as part of heritage are already considered in the domain of cultural and natural heritage. So I mentioned earlier that what I failed to include in the slides for natural and cultural heritage are the works of of man only, because we I showed there the works, well, not the works, no, but natural features, and then the works of man and nature. So the third one would have been only the works of man, and architecture houses are part of that. While interactive design media content is included in the domain of audiovisual and interactive media. In this example, the Coconut Palace designed by architect Manyosa is already listed in the cultural and natural heritage domain. We next consider heritage and the heritage resource classification. So heritage is defined as something that is passed down from preceding generations. Okay, so um, it is important that it is passed down, otherwise it loses its value as a heritage resource. The heritage domain follows a different pattern than the other domains. Most of the activities which occur in this domain are related to preservation and conservation. In this regard, from an economic viewpoint, heritage is an asset. So the value of assets can be enhanced or devalued depending on how they are maintained. And this is something that advocates of heritage conservation still needs to work on um, in convincing people that heritage is actually an asset. Economic studies have analyzed the economic value of cultural heritage in relation to the public's preferences. So they calculate a value of use based upon the amount someone is willing to pay to preserve a cultural heritage or to visit a site. Okay, um, so it depends really how much people would like to spend to maintain the place so that they can continue using it, or at least to visit a place. These calculations also cover the non-use value of cultural heritage. We're asking how much someone is willing to pay for the preservation of a heritage asset for future generations. So it does not have to be used now, but it can be used later by the future generations. In general, heritage can be categorized as either tangible or intangible. So tangible heritage resources are those that has materiality. Examples are painting, architecture, sculpture, household implements, etc. Intangible heritage resources, on the other hand, are immaterial. Examples include songs, dance, drama, customs, etc. In the Philippines, the following categories were adopted: movable, immovable, and intangible heritage. Basically, the only difference is that the tangible heritage resources are further divided into two, movable and immovable. So, immovable heritage includes traditions and living expressions that are passed down from generation to generation within a particular community. Um, and these are things that you cannot move. That's why they're called immovable. No? Um, it's either because it's too big or it's not supposed to be moved. There are further classified into seven subcategories, namely church complexes and colonial fortifications, mosque complexes and temple complexes, indigenous place of worship or Nambana complexes, modern and historical residences, structures related to industry, transportation and public works, archaeological sites, and miscellaneous structures and sites. Movable heritage are national cultural treasures under the movable heritage bracket. They are artifacts that are considered worthy of preservation for the future. Okay, so they can be carried around, so it is also possible to move them around. So these are further classified into the following subcategories: ancient documents or artifacts with pre-colonial writings, archaeological materials, ethnic crafts, historical materials owned by historical persons, families or organization, um, historical materials owned by historical persons, families or organizations, paintings, sculptures, and writings and other literary works. Intangible heritage is cultural heritage, tradition, and living expressions that are passed down from generation to generation within a particular community. There are also subcategories of this heritage. One is oral traditions and expressions, including language. So, your alibata, for example, performing arts, so you have to teach them the dance moves, and it has to be taught throughout generations. Social practices, rituals, and festive events. How some tribes, for example, um, conduct their wedding ceremony. Knowledge and practice concerning nature and the universe, our beliefs, for example, about the universe. And traditional craftsmanship, or the tradition of making crafts, not the craft itself. Okay, how to make the um, copy shell windows, uh, which were used before the olden times. Our next topic is cultural heritage. According to UNESCO, cultural heritage includes artifacts, monuments, and groups of buildings and sites that have a diversity of values, including symbolic, historic, artistic, aesthetic, ethnological, or anthropological scientific, and social significance. Okay, in the Philippines, we refer to them as cultural properties. The heritage law of the Philippines defines cultural property as all products of human creativity by which a people and a nation reveal their identity, including architecture and sites or human activity, the natural history, specimens, and sites, whether public or privately owned, movable or immovable, tangible or intangible. So in the Philippines, cultural properties are categorized as follows. So grade 1 level, grade 2 level, grade 3 level, and local cultural properties. Grade 1 level includes World Heritage Sites, National Cultural Treasures, National Historical Landmarks, National Historical Shrines, and National Historical Monuments. So World Heritage Sites are inscribed by UNESCO. We have to apply, the Philippines has to apply for a site to be declared as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. For example, Vegan did that, and then when they were accepted, so there was a lot of celebration. These are cultural properties which are important for the whole of humanity. Um, these places are considered as World Heritage, so they do not only benefit the Philippines, so they benefit also the other countries, not the whole world. Examples outside the Philippines include the Acropolis in Athens, the Colosseum in Rome, and the Hiroshima Peace Memorial in Japan. In the Philippines, some examples include the Church of Santo Tomas de Villanueva in Miagao in Iloilo, which is shown in the picture, the Church of San Agustin in Pawai in Ilocos Norte, and the rice terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras. So there is a uh, scientific value on the way that the church was made architecturally. Okay, so the Miagao Church, for example, which other countries would study because they represent other countries also. National cultural treasures are unique cultural property found locally, possessing outstanding historical, cultural, and artistic and or scientific value, which is highly significant and important to the country, and officially declared as such by the pertinent cultural agency. An example is the Kawayan Torogan House in Lanao del Sur, which you see here in the picture. So, um, so this is the next step after World Heritage structure. So if they benefit the country only, not necessarily outside, So they are the national cultural treasures. National historical landmarks are sites or structures that are associated with events or achievements significant to Philippine history as declared by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. So our example here is the Malacanang Palace. So we all know that so many historical events have transpired in this structure. Another example is like the House of Emilio Aguinaldo. So Philippines independence was declared. National historical shrines are historical sites or structures hallowed and revered for their history or association as declared by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. So example here is the Corregidor. The whole island itself is like a shrine. So if you take a tour, so you see all the ruins, and then you get a sense of what it was before during the Second World War. National historical monuments are structures that honor illustrious persons or commemorate events of historical value as declared by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. For example, here is the Quezon City Memorial Circle, where you find the mausoleum, which is this tall structure which houses the remains of former President Manuel Quezon. Grade 2 level are important cultural properties as declared by either the National Museum, the National Library, or the National Archive, unless otherwise delisted. They include the following: Filipiniana materials, works by Manilica ng Bayan, works of national artists, archaeological traditional ethnographic materials declared by the National Museum, works and structures with NHCP historical markers, archival materials and documents declared by the National Archives, rare books and incunabula declared by the National Library, all holotypes of fossils, plants, and animals, structures dating at least 50 years old, and archival materials documenting or documents dating at least 50 years old. So I will show here a few examples. One is the works by Manilica ng Bayan. These are a group of artists recognized by the government of the Philippines for their contribution to the country's intangible heritage. For example, in a certain place, they are the tribe or they are the people who actually like invented this type of weaving or this type of cooking. So that's why they become the Americana Bayan. Another example under grade 2 is the works of national artists like the works of Napoleon Abueva, who is the national artist for sculptures of the Philippines. And then another example is the Guyangan cave system in Romblon for archaeological traditional ethnographic material. So all other cultural properties in the Registry of Cultural Properties not declared as grade 1 or grade 2 shall be grade 3 cultural properties. So they are deemed as important cultural property unless otherwise delisted. So this list includes archaeological materials not classified as grade 1 or 2 that have been listed by the National Museum, ethnographic materials that are at least 50 years old from the date of collection and with cultural significance and proper documentation, and all other Filipiniana materials not classified as grade 1 or 2 as declared by the National Library. Because it can happen that you discover a book, for example, which is more than 50 years old, but then its significance to the whole country is still under study. So meantime, but they are not declared as either grades 1 or 2, so they remain grade 3. Local cultural properties are those declared by the pertinent sanggunian or Legislative Assembly. So regional cultural property designated by ordinance of the Regional Legislative Assembly and so forth. No? Provincial cultural property designated by ordinance of the Sangguniang Panlalawigan. For city cultural property, it's the Sangguniang Panlunsod. Municipal cultural property by the Sangguniang Bayan, and barangay cultural property designated by ordinance of the Sangguniang Bayan or Sangguniang Barangay. Um, so it may happen that uh, in a place, whether a city or a barangay, there is something which they value more. And um, so a first step would be to declare it as a cultural property. And when it is now recognized by the government and ascribed as grade 3 before actually being ascribed as intergrade 1 or 2, so at least the cultural property is protected from either demolition or other interventions which are not in keeping with proper conservation practice. Okay, but it can also be possible that it's already ascribed as grade 1, 2, or 3, and yet they are also declared as such by the corresponding legislative assemblies. Although this is not practical anymore, because one reason for ascribing aside from protection is actually to get funding for its conservation. So it doesn't make sense to have two declarations, one from the national government, and then another one from the local government. So we finally discussed the related domains to UNESCO's framework for cultural statistics. Okay. Tourism is qualitatively different from the other cultural domains as it cannot be classified readily as a sector in the traditional sense, which means it's measured, which is the traditional sense is measured by either a particular market or industrial output. Rather, tourism is better understood as a demand-driven, consumer-defined activity, and as such is linked intimately with all other domains within the cultural sector, as each contains activities that are undertaken regularly by tourists. So all the six cultural domains actually has a tourism component within it. Okay, regardless how small the product is. For example, people would probably um, go to London Tower not only for the place but probably to see a crown or a jewelry, which is very valuable for the country. So, um, and that activity of going there is already tourism. Sports is considered as in the FCS in its broader definition as it includes organized and or competitive sports as well as physical fitness and well-being and physical recreation activities. Both professional and amateur sports are reflected in the FCS. This domain also includes recreation, which is defined as an activity undertaken for pleasure or relaxation that diverts, amuses, or stimulates. It includes gambling, amusement and theme parks, and other leisurely activities. It excludes physical recreational activities which are included in sports. So sports itself is not a cultural, it's not part of cultural domain. It is only a related domain. It can happen that some sports become a national sports, for example, sepak takraw. But then all other sports and all other activities for amusement are like universal other than any other culture or uh, countries. So they are not. considered cultural domain. So that covers all the topics for this lecture on the overview of cultural heritage. So thank you very much.